Hello and welcome back. Thanks for tuning in to another video presentation. Today we talk about language objectives. Today's topic circles around 5 key issues. First, language and content are so interconnected that teachers, regardless of content area, should be able to support their students' language development too. Second, as you saw in the previous chapter, the student's strengths and needs, including language and content, serve as a foundation for creating learning objectives. Third, through content objectives, we make sure that students learn and develop facts, ideas, and processes. Fourth, through language objectives, we make sure that students have and or develop the language proficiency related to the content. Finally, objectives determine the tasks that we incorporate in the teaching and learning process. All right, let's define some terms. Standards, goals, or learning targets are general statements of learning outcomes. They are the broad targets we teach to. They are long-term plans. We know, for instance, based on Common Core state standards, what competencies our students will have acquired at the end of each grade, or what competencies our students have achieved at the end of the elementary school or the secondary school. However, as goals are abstract and broad, they need to be objectified or broken down for teaching and learning practices. And that's what we know as objectives. Objectives are statements of concrete, measurable, and attainable lesson outcomes. They are basically short-term plans to achieve goals. Finally, there are tasks or activities that we engage our students in, hoping that they will reach the objectives and ultimately the goals. So, as you can see, tasks are in service of meeting the objectives, and objectives are in service of meeting the standards. It's like climbing a mountain. The mountain peak is where you're trying to get your student to. That's the goal, that's the target, that's the standard. But in order to get there, your students need to pass through several checkpoints. These are the objectives they need to meet. And to reach those, they engage in different activities that you devise for them to scaffold the process. Let's take a look at an example. This is a 6th grade English language arts standard about reading literature. According to this standard, at the end of the 6th grade, students are expected to be able to cite textual evidence to support analysis of what the text says explicitly, as well as inferences drawn from the text. As can be seen, this statement is very broad. That's why it's a standard. To meet this standard, the students are expected to have developed several competencies. They should know how to cite textual evidence. They should know how to analyze the text. They should know how to look for specific pieces of information. They should know how to make inferences and many other skills and sub-skills which come with this specific standard. To teach students about each skill and sub-skill, then this standard needs to be narrowed down and objectified. One of the objectives could be for students to demonstrate an understanding of inferences. And one of the tasks which could help students meet the objective could be completing a worksheet based on a text that they read. Alright, now that we know what objectives are and why they're important, let's take a look at how objectives are constructed. There are three parts to a content objective. The first part is the fixed phrase students will be able to, or SUBAT for short, which is a prediction of the outcome of the objective. The second part to a content objective is the measurable outcome, which is the criterion based on which the student will be evaluated. Finally, the third part of a content objective is the exact content to be learned. Let's take a look at an example. This content objective has been developed for a lesson about the history of the United States, specifically about the Civil War. As can be seen, this content objective starts with the fixed phrase SUBAT, or students will be able to, and it proceeds with the concrete measurable outcome, name, and finally the content to be learned, 3 of 5 central causes of the Civil War in writing, which is also part of the outcome. So based on this objective, the teacher knows what they need to center the teaching and learning experiences on, and then the student also will be evaluated on their knowledge of naming 3 of 5 central causes of the Civil War in writing. Alright, you have reached a checkpoint. Now take some rest and do this activity. Alright, welcome back. Well, the information which has been presented so far may not have been new to you. It might have been a review on what you already know about content objectives, and you have most likely developed them as part of your other courses and your student teaching. Here's the part that this course comes in handy: creating language objectives. So what are language objectives? As the name suggests, language objectives are objectives which are set to help the development of the language which is required to access the content and process. While content objectives focus on the content, the development of the content, facts, ideas, processes, language objectives help both English language learners and non-English language learners with the language which is needed in order to access the content, or basically meet the content objective. Language objectives are developed based on content objectives and students' needs. The teacher's knowledge of a student's current language skills plays a role in the development of language objectives. And like content objectives, language objectives also present measurable, achievable outcomes. This diagram shows the relationship between content objectives and language objectives. As can be seen, content objectives determine language objectives. For example, here, as you can see, the content objective is students will be able to identify 3 central causes of the Civil War. And here, as you can see, the language objective is students will be able to use past tense verbs correctly to talk about historical situations. Uh, Part of a student's meeting of identifying three central causes of the Civil War is talking about the past. And this is a language ability that we need to make sure that the students have in order to be able to meet the content objective. And the purpose of a language objective is basically supporting the meeting of the content objective in that way. All right, so how are language objectives constructed? Well, as you know, language objectives are needs-based. To construct language objectives, first we need to determine language needs. Language needs are divided into 5 categories: vocabulary, language functions, grammar, discourse, and language learning strategies. Of course, to participate in class activities and meet the content objectives, students, both English language learners and non-English language learners, require language. They require vocabulary items such as concept words. They require language functions to be able to, for instance, define, compare and contrast, etc. They require grammar to be able to structure the language and and be able to collaborate or cooperate with their peers. Also, they need discourse. They need to be able to function properly within different genres depending on the content. They need to know how autobiographies are constructed. They should be able to write autobiographies, uh, etc. And also, they need language learning strategies to learn the language. So they need to be able to take notes. They need to be able to know how to scan, how to skim, and many other strategies that they employ to learn. And we teachers are there for them to support them uh, uh, with learning those strategies. Let's take a look at an example from earlier slides. The content objective, students will be able to state 3 of 5 central causes of the Civil War in writing, and can potentially challenge an English language learner in many ways. So there are vocabulary items to be learned, words such as slavery, north, south. Of course, these words need to be learned by non-English language learners, but compared to them, English language learners will probably face a bigger challenge because English is not their mother tongue. So they also need grammar to form past tense and complete sentences. So, and we know how complicated tense could be. There are several forms, all used to indicate a past tense. And complete sentences also have uh, their own ways of construction. Word order is a problem, and so many things to go into that. Also, discourse. Students need to be able to narrate and report, and these are two genres within the discourse of historical uh, writing, which is called for in this specific content objective. Also, several functions are called for. Students should be able to identify main ideas. They should make statements. They should be able to make statements. They should be able to summarize, define words, use cause and effect. Spelling is important, and also arguing is important, to name a few, of course. And lastly, strategies. Some strategies which are helpful to English language learners specifically are note taking, listening strategically, uh, and extracting information from the context, So of course these are all these components are needed by both English language learners and non-English language learners, but uh, English language learners will require a lot of scaffolding and support uh, from the teacher to be able to meet the content objectives. All right, here's the formula for constructing language objectives. As you can see, it is very similar to that of constructing content objectives. It starts with SUBAT, or students will be able to, and you still have a measurable outcome verb or an action verb. But what you have here, which is different, is the language need instead of the content to be learned. So, and the language need is determined by the task, basically, the content objective. For example, in the case of the previous example, your students need to make past tense forms correctly. So a possible language objective could be students will be able to use past tense correctly to talk about historical events. Talking about historical events is the language need required for this specific task. And the measurable outcome is the use of past tense correctly. That's what the students are evaluated on at the end of uh, the activity. So, and as part of your job, then you would work with the students to make sure they know how to construct past tense correctly so that they can talk about historical events. All right, and that's language objectives. Please feel free to share your ideas and or your questions on the discussion board, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. So today's tasks are one, submitting your language objectives. So basically what you need to do is look into the objectives part of the lesson that you're developing for this semester. So you submitted your idea, the lesson topic, the grade level, and language domains, language demands 3 weeks ago as part of the language demands task. So now you need to build on that assignment and delve into the objectives part of the lesson. So the worksheet attached to the assignment page will allow you to structure the objectives part of your lesson. The worksheet will allow you to compose your content objectives, and based on the content objectives, then your language objectives. So at the beginning of the worksheet, you should be able to state your content objective following the formula you learned in this chapter. Students will be able to plus measurable verb plus content to be learned. And then based on this content objective, you should specify the language needs required to meet this content objective. So the worksheet will allow you to get to your language objective or language objectives step by step. So first you determine the needs. You talk about key vocabulary which is needed. You talk about language functions and strategies. You also talk about grammar or language structures. And finally, you also talk about the importance of these needs for the purpose of meeting the content objective. You need to circle and you know and finally at the end of the worksheet you state your language objective or language objectives explicitly. So the worksheet is pretty straightforward, but if you have any questions, please feel free to also ask on this discussion board or email me. The second task to do today is posing questions to our guest speaker. There's a Google Doc attached to week 11 module on Canvas where you can find more information about our guest speaker, and you can also ask questions. This activity is time sensitive as I'm supposed to provide our guest with the questions by the end of today. So please be sure to submit your questions in the Google Doc as soon as you can. Also, this activity counts towards your participation in the course. Thank you so much for your time. Please feel free to contact me should you have any questions or concerns. Have a wonderful rest of the day.